So far in the offseason, since the playoffs have ended for the Montreal Canadiens, we've talked about the need to go out and get a 2C, the need to get a right shot defenseman, who's available, who's not. We've talked about the Brady Tkachuk deal. We've talked about Carey Price going to the Hall of Fame. We've talked about what's going to happen with Brendan Gallagher. But here's the question that a lot of people are asking. Can Marty St. Louis become more like Rod Brind'Amour? And I'm not talking about from a perspective of personality because that's not going to happen. And I'm not talking in their background because their player acumen is completely different. And not by turning the Montreal Canadiens into the Carolina Hurricanes overnight because that's not going to happen. But just in philosophy, in standard, and in accountability, and in the way every single player on the bench understands exactly what the team's supposed to look like. Because when you watch the Carolina Hurricanes, there's one thing that's abundantly clear. You see a team where all 20 players are pulling in the same direction. They forecheck, they reload, they pressure, they shoot, they recover pucks, and then they do it again and again and again. Call it what it is, relentless. That's not just about talent. It's about coaching and it's about identity. And for the Canadiens, that's where the next step has to come from because the Canadiens have speed and skill, and they've got young players who can make plays in open ice. But the thing about playoff hockey is that it doesn't always give you open ice. Sometimes you have to create it yourself. Other times you have to grind through it. And sometimes you have to stop waiting for the pretty play and just start overwhelming teams with pressure. So it's time for us to talk a little bit about coaching. And of course, we'll talk some puck. So let's get into this discussion. And before we do, let me remind you guys once again that this coming Friday, I'll be live at 7 p.m. covering the draft. How am I going to cover it? I don't know. It's my first time doing it. But one way or the other, it's going to be fun. The live chat's going to be going. Everybody's going to be able to get their 2 cents in on every pick, and we can move forward and have a little bit of fun. So make sure you come to the channel at 7 p.m. this coming Friday for PuckTalk Live Draft Edition. And of course, if you're not subscribed to the channel, make sure you do that now so that you get your notification and you know when I go live on Friday night. But for this episode, let's start with this. Obviously, the Montreal Canadiens shouldn't try to become the Carolina Hurricanes, right? That would be a huge mistake. We've seen other teams try to mimic the Stanley Cup champions over and over and over again. What happens is they start doing it, and midway through, they have to change it up because, the next champion looks a little different. Right? Montreal's best young players aren't built exactly like Carolina's core either, right? Suzuki is not Sebastian Aho, and Cole Caulfield's not Seth Jarvis. And God knows that Slafkovsky, other than his name starting with an S, isn't Andrei Svechnikov. Lane Hudson is nowhere near as good defensively as Jacob Slavin. And honestly, Marty St. Louis is not Rod Brind'Amour. And all those things are fine. The point's not to copy the roster. The idea, though, is to copy the standard. Carolina has a system in place where their fourth line understands the same game as the first line. Their defensemen activate with purpose. Their forwards also track back with purpose. Their shots aren't always highlight reel chances, but they pile up pressure, and that's why you see their shot totals through the roof every game. They force their opponents to make mistakes, and they make the other team defend shift after shift. That has to be the lesson for Montreal. The Canadiens can still be a fast team, they can be creative, and they can have skill as part of their identity, but they need to become harder. They need to have a harder layer underneath that. Speed cannot just mean rush chances. It has to mean pressure and closing speed. And it means getting on top of other teams before they're ready to breathe. That's where Marty St. Louis can borrow from what Rod Brind'Amour has done in Carolina. Not the exact system, but that relentless mentality. Because you have to admire it, after all. And the thing Carolina does better than almost anyone is define roles without shrinking players. And that's a really big distinction because how many times do coaches define roles and limit their players, right? Rod Brind'Amour defines roles by connecting players to the team identity. One guy's job might be to score. The other guy's is to check. Another guy's job might be to win battles along the wall. And another might be to get the puck below the goal line. Somebody else's job might be to take a hit to extend possession. But everybody has a specific job, and nobody is above doing the work. There's no passengers on the Carolina Hurricanes. I think we can all admit to that, right? That's why Carolina can roll their lines without worrying about it. That's why they can pressure in waves, and that's why their third and fourth lines don't feel like survival minutes. They feel like continuation minutes, for lack of a better way of putting it. And that's the key word here from Montreal, continuation. Right now, if you look at the Montreal Canadiens offense, the Canadiens' best hockey comes from the skilled players when they're dictating. When Suzuki, Caulfield, Slavkovsky, Hudson, and the offensive pieces have time and space, the Canadiens look really dangerous. But the question is, what happens when that space disappears? What happens when the top line is checked hard like they were in these playoffs? What happens when the rush game is taken away, like it was after game one of the Eastern Conference Final? What happens when the other team says, you're not getting easy offense tonight? That's when the balance in your lineup truly matters. And that's when a coach needs to be more than just about his talent. He needs to have a full team engine. And that's where Brind'Amour's Carolina team have been the model, not just now, but for the past few years. Now, we know the Canadiens are most comfortable when the game opens up, right? Quick transition, controlled entries, east-west movement, skill in space, defensemen joining the rush, young forwards attacking with a little bit of pace. And that's fun hockey. And it's also dangerous hockey when it's working. But there's a difference between fast hockey and Brind'Amour's version of pressure hockey. Fast hockey can disappear when the neutral zone gets clogged. Pressure hockey travels a lot better. It works in the playoffs. And pressure hockey works when the ice gets really small. And it works when referees put their whistles away. That has to be the evolution that the Canadiens need. Not by adding less skill, but adding more pressure behind that skill. Not less creativity, but more structure underneath that creativity. And you're not trying to slow your team down, but you're trying to create more directness with the speed that you have. Because Carolina's pressure isn't some random type of chaos. It's organized chaos. The first forward always goes in hard on the forecheck to pressure the puck carrier. The second guy comes in to support. The third forward stays above all that and closes out the middle. The defensemen hold the line, and the weak side winger, he reloads. The whole team moves in as one unit on the forecheck. And that's what Montreal has to build towards. There's too many times that we see the Canadiens come in with a forward coming in on the forecheck and nobody's there in support. That has to change. Doesn't matter if it's line 1 or it's line 4. It's got to be cohesive throughout the lineup. And when one Montreal Canadien pressures, the next Canadian has to know where to be. When one player dumps the puck in, the next two players have to arrive on the opposite side of the ice when the puck's rammed in with the purpose of getting the puck back. When one defenseman pinches, there has to be a forward that has to cover. It's not about killing creativity. It's about taking the creativity that you have and giving it a foundation. And the first thing that Marty St. Louis has to take away from Brind'Amour's style of coaching the Hurricanes is the work rate has to be non-negotiable. And I'm not talking about an emotional work rate. I'm not talking about we tried hard tonight. I'm talking about a real work rate where stuff's repeatable, shift after shift, line after line. The Canadiens can't be a team where only certain players forecheck hard, right? Where you're going to have maybe just Slavkovsky coming in hard on the forecheck. It's got to be whoever's there first. They can't be a team where only the bottom 6 are expected to play a heavy style of game because that's not going to work. And they can't be a team where the skilled players get to play one kind of game and the rest of the depth guys have to play something completely different. That's where Brind'Amour brings the standard in. The best players work, the depth players work, and the defensemen work. And your goalie sees a connected team in front of him. For Marty St. Louis, that means the standard has to become a little bit more demanding. And it's not about getting negative. And it's not old school yelling for the sake of yelling, but being demanding. If you want more ice time, you pressure. If you want more offensive freedom, you reload. If you want more power play minutes, you win pucks back. And if you want to play late in games, you learn how to manage the puck. That's how young teams mature. And that's how skill becomes winning hockey. Now, one of the biggest differences between Carolina and Montreal, we know what I'm going to say here. Carolina doesn't always wait for the perfect play. They shoot to create the next play. They shoot for rebounds and chaos. They shoot to keep tired defenders facing their own net, and they shoot to make the other team defend one more layer. Montreal has too many moments where the play has to be clean. They have to make another pass, they have to make another move, delay one more time, and they have to search for the perfect lane. That might work in November where teams haven't found their game yet or their legs, but that gets harder to do in months like April, May, and June. For the Canadiens to become a little bit more like the Hurricanes, St. Louis has to make shot volume part of their team identity. And I'm not talking about low-quality shots from the point with no traffic. That's not an answer. That's just purposeless volume, right? We're talking about shooting pucks through layers, getting shots off recoveries in tight, getting shots after the pucks move from low to high movement with bodies in front of the net, and shots that create second and third chances. That's how you turn the finesse that your team already has into sustained pressure. Caulfield still can be your finisher. Suzuki can be your playmaker. And Slavkovsky can still use his hands and vision. Hudson can still manipulate defenders and make guys break their ankles when he makes moves at the blue line. But the team has to become a hell of a lot less obsessed with a perfect chance. Sometimes the perfect chance is really created by the first ugly shot. That's a Carolina lesson that Montreal needs to learn here and now. And when people talk about Carolina, they often talk about the forecheck, but the forecheck only works because the lineup is balanced. You can't forecheck relentlessly if only one line can do it. You can't pressure in waves if your third line just trying not to get scored on. And you can't roll out four lines if your fourth line has no particular identity. And that's where Kent Hughes and Marty St. Louis have to work together. The Canadiens need more forwards who can play fast, play hard, and still make a play. That's why, as you've looked at everything I've said since the end of the season in terms of player acquisition, it's been molded around that particular thing. I want guys with skill. I want guys that are tough. I want guys that are physical, and I want guys that can play through pressure. Not grinders and not just skill guys, but hybrid players. Guys that I know will be able to translate in the playoffs. Players who can win battles and then make the next pass. Players who can finish checks and still keep up with the pace of the game. Players who can forecheck without turning the puck over. And players who can make the coach comfortable rolling his own bench. And Rod Brind'Amour and the Carolina Hurricanes have had that for years. Brind'Amour's been behind the Carolina bench for 8 years. And how many times has he gotten to the Eastern Conference Final? That's not some fluke. That's because he's taken his philosophy, he's allowed the general manager to build a roster that works around his philosophy, and he moves forward from there as a unit. Their lineup doesn't feel like two scoring lines and two lines just trying to survive. It's a hell of a lot more connected to that, and Montreal has to get there. Because if the Canadiens want to become a playoff team that imposes itself, they need a third line that can tilt the ice. They also need a fourth line that can create energy without taking penalties and without looking like they're skating through quicksand. And they need defensive pairs that can move the puck under pressure. That's why you need a right-handed D in the first place. And they need every line to have its own purpose, not just names on the whiteboard. So here's the message that matters here, because the more like becoming more like Carolina doesn't mean asking skilled players to become checkers. That's completely not what I'm saying. It's the wrong interpretation of my words. You don't want Caulfield thinking like a fourth line winger, and you don't want Suzuki playing scared, and you don't want Lane Hudson stripped of creativity, and you certainly don't want Slavkovsky turned into a dump and chase only player. The goal isn't to reduce your talent. The goal is to make your talent harder to play against. That's the message that Marty St. Louis has to sell. And listen, I'm not talking about every guy in the lineup having to knock guys on their ass to get the puck. But we're talking about the simplest of things. When you're forechecking and a guy passes the puck, take a second to finish a body check. Don't just turn away. Let him know that you're there. Get in there faster. Extend your stick. Get to the right side of the angle to get him off the play. You want more offense? Then Marty St. Louis has to push for recovering more pucks. If you want more zone time, then pressure harder after you turn the puck over. You want more rush chances, then defend better above the puck. And if you want more space, then force other teams to defend below the goal line. That's how you survive playoff hockey. And that's how skill survives it. Not just survive by becoming a cutesy team, but surviving by becoming layered. Carolina's best players buy into the work that they have to do. Montreal's best players need to do the same thing. And to be fair, we got to say that Suzuki already plays a very responsible and mature game. And Slavkovsky has the frame to become a monster on retrievals. Caulfield has improved away from the puck as well. And Hudson competes harder than a lot of people expected for a guy his size. So the ingredients are there. But now the team identity has to demand it every single night. And the thing about this is simple. Carolina's pressure isn't just from the forwards. Their defensemen are aggressive too. They hold the blue line. They keep plays alive. They trust the forwards to cover. And that's a huge part of their shot volume. Montreal has pieces that can do some of that. Of course, Lane Hudson is built to extend offense. Mike Matheson can escape pucks into pressure. Kane Gooley can close space. David Reinbacher, if he becomes what the Canadiens hope, gives you a right shot stabilizer who can play by moving the puck north-south. But the key is coordination. If Montreal's defensemen activate, then the forwards have to support that activation. If forwards fly the zone too early, then the defensemen end up getting exposed. And if defensemen back off too much, then the forecheck altogether dies because you're opening up the neutral zone. That's where coaching really matters, and that's the part that Marty St. Louis has to catch up on in terms of the way Rod Brind'Amour does it. It's where Marty St. Louis has to make the reads automatic because pressure hockey only works when 5 players are connected together. Not 2 or 3, but 5. That's why I always say that the Canadiens need to come out of their zone as a 5-man unit and not by trying to jump the zone. There's a difference between looking fast and playing fast. And that's where it is. You can look fast when you make stretch passes through the neutral zone when it's open, but when that neutral zone is cut off and you force your defenseman to skate the puck up into pressure, that's where you get yourself into trouble, especially in your own zone. And listen, Marty St. Louis has done a lot of good things in Montreal. He's helped rebuild belief in this city because after 2021 and after what we saw at the beginning of the next season, there wasn't very much left in Montreal. He's allowed the young players to grow, and he's created an environment where skill isn't treated as a problem. And that really mattered because Montreal, over time, had found its way of stifling skill. And the Canadiens really needed to stop doing that. But the next step that he has to take is a little bit different because it's not just about development anymore. It's about setting the standard. That means harder lineup decisions and less tolerance for passengers. It means showing more accountability when puck management is loose. And it means rewarding players who drive the team identity and not just players with talent. And that's where Brind'Amour is extremely strong. His teams look like they know exactly what earns trust. St. Louis has to get Montreal to that same point. Not by becoming a colder coach, because obviously they love him, and not by losing the teaching side of what makes him so valuable, but by making the teaching a little bit more demanding. The Canadiens aren't going to be a rebuilding team forever. At some point, lessons have to become expectations, and expectations have to become habits. That's the shift that the Montreal Canadiens are going to be looking for. So ultimately, when I say all this, right, when I compare Marty St. Louis to Rod Brind'Amour, and not their style of coaching, but the version of the Montreal Canadiens that we want, what exactly is the Montreal Canadiens version of Carolina actually supposed to look like? Well, it will look something like this. You're going to have a top line that still creates offense, but spends more time below the hash marks. So a little bit more on the cycle and a lot less in terms of standing still and looking for the perfect pass. You're going to have a second line that can attack with speed, but also win matchups. Your third line isn't going to be just a defensive line. It can pressure, shoot, and wear down other teams. And your fourth line is going to give Montreal momentum instead of just killing ice time. Defensemen who hold the offensive blue line, they're going to need to do that with confidence. And forwards, they're going to be the ones that reload automatically. That you generate more shots, more net traffic, second chances, and more offensive zone shifts that force the other team to defend for 35, 40, or 45 seconds. That's how Montreal becomes harder to play against. Not by becoming slower, by becoming heavier for the sake of being heavier. Not like that, but becoming more relentless. That's what I called Carolina. That's what I want Montreal to be. A fast team that pressures, a skilled team that checks, a young team that plays with detail. That's the balance, and that's the next step for the Montreal Canadiens. So here's the bottom line. Marty St. Louis doesn't have to become Rod Brind'Amour, but he does need to take something from him. And that's setting a standard, the lineup balance, the 20-man identity, the idea that every player from line 1 to line 4 has to contribute to the same style of hockey. Because Carolina doesn't beat teams only with talent. They beat them with repetition, pressure, and by making teams feel every shift like work. That's where the Canadiens have to get to. Montreal already has all the skill and speed they need, and they've got a young core. Now they need to build the right habits. They need to learn the pressure. The shot volume has to be there. They need to learn how to forecheck better, and they need the details that travel when the game gets really ugly. Because in the playoffs, open ice is not given. You have to earn it. And if Martin St. Louis gets the Canadiens to understand all that, if you can blend the speed and skill with Carolina's pressure and commitment, then this team becomes a hell of a lot more than just exciting. They become very dangerous. Not just in the regular season, but in the playoffs. And that's really the next step that we're looking for. So I'll leave you with this. Should Marty St. Louis push the Canadiens towards more of a Rod Brind'Amour identity? Or do you think Montreal should stay close to its speed skill foundation? Drop your take in the comments because this is the next big question for the Canadiens. Not whether they have talent, because we know that they do. The question is whether they can turn that talent into a 20-man playoff machine. Be sure to hype and like this video. Subscribe to Puck Talk Montreal, like I told you, if you haven't already, especially with the draft show coming up this coming Friday at 7. And as always, keep your skates down, stick on the ice, go Habs go.